Hello, everyone. So exciting to see people trickling in. I hope you all are having a great evening so far, East Coast, West Coast, wherever you are. I hope you're having an amazing day. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our second session of the FGLI series for College Essay Guide. Tonight's session is on the basics for supporting undocumented students. We'll get started in just a moment, but as always, we'll start with a quick check-in question. Tonight's check-in question, which our lovely moderator, Jasmine, will also drop in the chat, is what is one mundane thing that you're grateful for? So just kind of an everyday thing that you are grateful for. I was thinking about this earlier today, and I'm just super grateful for public transportation. I live and am based in Boston, and while the public transportation can be rocky sometimes, I'm just very grateful to have ways to kind of quickly be in different parts of the city at once. So that's kind of my mundane gratitude for the evening. And I would love to have our presenters also share while you all share in the chat. So Geraldine, what's like a mundane thing that you're grateful for tonight?
That is a wonderful question. And I actually do my little gratitude journal. So I try as much as possible to list 3 things I'm grateful for. And I didn't do that today. So this is a great opportunity to reflect. I think I'm grateful for the fact that I live so close to my workplace right now. So I was able to go home for lunch, have a longer lunch. I made my little asada and beans and rice dish, if you'll call it that, and then was able to hop back to work in about 5 minutes. So grateful for the proximity to work and home.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Geraldine. What about you, Andrea?
That's got me thinking. It's funny, the first thing that came to my mind are my sneaker insoles, my inserts. I had foot surgery a few years ago, and I love walking. Me and my grandmother walk a lot and talk. I walk my dog, and wasn't able to do it for a long time because I just couldn't find comfortable shoes. And so I'm very grateful for my shoe inserts for facilitating a lot of family time and a lot of dog walk time.
Yeah, for sure. Amazing. Thank you both for sharing. And I'm seeing some lovely answers in the chat, from audiobooks to book clubs to beautiful weather, all wonderful things to be grateful for this evening. So thank you all again for being here. My name is Diana Alvarado. I work part-time with College Essay Guide and the Matchlighter Scholars Program to really put together this FGLI series that we're piloting this year. In my full-time role, I work for a nonprofit organization based out of Boston called the Upward Project, where we support high-achieving first-gen low-income students in their college and career development journeys. So I'm really grateful to be with you all tonight. Our moderator, Jasmine, is also going to drop in the chat a link to a Google form, which is just kind of a quick poll for you all in the room to see what you're interested in continuing to see as we continue building this series out. So if you could take a second to fill that out, that would be great. But without further ado, I would just love to kind of pass it over to our presenters. We have 2 amazing presenters today. We have Geraldine Castañeda from Pomona College and Andrea Keenan from Excel Academy. They'll both introduce themselves in more detail when their sections of the presentation come along. In the meantime, Jasmine is here, so if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat as the session is going on. We will have kind of a more structured Q&A portion at the end, but if there are any like resource-specific questions you have in the moment, please do feel free to drop that in the chat, and Jasmine will collect them for our presenters. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to our first speaker tonight, which is Andrea Keenan. So passing it over to you.
Thank you, Diana. I'm so grateful for you. You're anything but mundane, but I'm very, very grateful that you asked me and Geraldine to join you tonight. And for everyone in the room, just excited to spend the next hour going over the basics for supporting undocumented students. I think Geraldine and I both agree when we say we could talk about this topic for hours and hours and hours. And so 1 hour is just sort of the starting point, hopefully for many of us, to start engaging in these conversations or to continue to build up our knowledge. So a little bit about me. I'm a high school counselor right now. So my portion of the presentation is going to focus on giving you tools to kickstart your work with immigrant students at your schools or organizations, as well as giving you resources that you can dig into a little bit later. And so why I'm coming to you tonight is I like to introduce myself as very much an ally and advocate someone who spent many years on the ground in high schools, but I'm by no means an immigration lawyer. So I will be talking about statuses and best practices, but all from a lens of a high school counselor and administrator. So even though I've consulted with a lot of immigration attorneys, have been through my own immigration process as an immigrant, formerly undocumented, I by no means am the authority on all things immigration. So if you are having questions about very specific statuses, things weaving in and out of statuses, please drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them. Otherwise, please reach out to me after the presentation. Always love to engage in conversations with people about this topic that's close to my heart. I'm out of East Boston at Excel Academy Charter High School. So if you're in the area, would love to connect. This is my 12th year in the field, and I'm a proud Mexican American person and first-gen college goer. So this is particularly poignant for me to now be able to sort of give back to my students and train other counselors in this arena. So happy to meet you all. So let's get going. I've been doing webinars and presentations for a little while as I train up my fellow counselors around me. And I used to spend a lot of time in these presentations going through statuses one by one, in depth. And the more I think about it, the more that I've come to realize that actually what high school counselors need is a framework for thinking about how to engage in this work that is really hard work. It takes a little bit of extra thought. And so here are my sort of 3 grounding best practices that I try to infuse in my everyday practice, but also with my team at our high school. So my headline is that for us to effectively counsel and help or mentor, just be there for our undocumented population, we have to be proactive and not just reactive. And I'm the first to tell you that it's hard because our days are long, they're jam-packed with meetings. If you teach, also with a lot of different sort of reactive things that we have to do as counselors. But hopefully the next 20, 25 minutes, I'll give you some ideas of things that you can put in motion as early as tomorrow, hopefully. My first grounding practice is to try to either do this with the people around you in your department, but if you have allies in the main office or your CEO of your nonprofit, try to sort of plant the seed that everyone in the organization should at least be aware of the general landscape they're working in. And so whether it's a hyperlocal landscape, you know, what are the undocumented or immigrant populations in my city, or what are they like in my state? That will impact how you do your work at your school and your organization. So that's a little bit more of a fact-finding best practice. Number 2 is self-disclosure. I used to never talk about self-disclosure, but the more that I've reflected over the last 12 years, this is actually one of the pillars of my work at my high school. The earlier that we can get our students to self-disclose, the better. And I'll give you some tools and tips for how to engage in that. I love to say that, you know, we love our students, we want to protect them, and sometimes we are on the side of sort of treating this topic as sort of hush-hush, or wanting to preserve privacy and trying to not overstep as practitioners. But there is a safe way to sort of liberate ourselves and liberate our campuses that still center the students' safety and privacy. And then the third one is talking about immigration, especially around the college application process, is something that educators need to be really open about. Myth bust whenever possible. Don't stay silent, whether that's in a small context, such as your office. Maybe there's posters that you put up. It's really important that you are constantly myth busting whenever you are moving around different spaces in your school or your organization. And also know that you don't have to be an expert on everything. So no answer is better than the wrong answer. Don't be, afraid to say, I don't know, but you know what? I'm on this journey with you and we'll figure it out. The more that we can be open about this, the more that our students will also be open about this. And so if you remember nothing else from my 25 minutes with you, please remember this. Student self-disclosure, coupled with your baseline knowledge and myth busting is going to equal a safe and productive post-secondary planning process for your students. So don't be afraid of self-disclosure, and we'll kind of go a little bit more in depth on what that means. So for the first one, how do we become proficient at even knowing what to ask for, even starting to understand what the landscape and context is around us? The first thing I want to make super clear, and many of you joining probably already know this, is that being an immigrant, having a status or lack thereof, it's not as black and white as being able to say, I'm a citizen, I'm a permanent resident, or I'm undocumented. There are so many shades of statuses within that. The American immigration system is extremely complex. It's evolving. Every year, there are new laws, new nuances to different statuses, and our families are more likely than not weaving in and out of different statuses, or maybe they're undocumented but trying to petition for status. And so at any given moment, it is a spectrum with many, many shades. If you at least get that, that is the perfect starting point. You by no means have to be an expert on all of the statuses that are out there. I tend to know a lot about them because I myself am an immigrant and I've lived through a lot of these statuses, and through a lot of experiences at my school, I've come to learn about all these statuses, but it's taken me about a decade to feel completely proficient in talking about all the different statuses out there. And even then, I'm not an immigration lawyer. So don't put that heavy expectation on your shoulders. It is enough to know that it's a messy, complex system. And it's enough to know that sometimes you don't know what you don't know, but you know enough to ask a few follow-up questions. And so, for example, just know that there are different statuses, designations, paperwork that immigrant students and families are filling out, petitioning. So you've got things like being a US national. You've got things like a naturalized citizen. For example, that's what I am. You've got things like paper I-94s, computer-generated I-94s, asylum granted, asylum pending, refugee status, TPS, temporary protected status. And this has been in the news a lot in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. Permanent resident, otherwise known as that green card. Conditional permanent residence, humanitarian parole, the brand new processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that the Biden administration just put forth. T visas, which are consequently the only visa that is eligible for Title IV federal financial aid funds. The U visa, J&F visas, other temporary visas, DACA, which is not actually a status, it's an exemption from deportation, but it's definitely a designation that we all have heard about a lot since it was signed as an executive order in 2012 by President Obama. Family-sponsored visas, Violence Against Women Act self-petitioners, which often lead to the permanent resident card, special immigrant juvenile status, which is what a lot of my unaccompanied minor students might sometimes apply for with the help of an immigration attorney, and of course, a lack of status, so undocumented. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think it does a good job of showing you just like what exists in this really complex ecosystem. And as counselors, it's kind of our job to know that this ecosystem is out there, right? We're not going to be experts. We're not going to know the ins and outs of every single thing, but the more we know that this is out there, the more we can have our ears perked up when our students say, hey, I think we've applied for asylum, but I'm not sure. Then maybe you know to ask, well, do you know that if your asylum has been granted, or is it still pending? Maybe next time your mom is in for a meeting, maybe we can talk about this. What do you think? Because knowing those nuances, even though they're pretty broad strokes, might be the difference between you advising the student, hey, actually, you are eligible for FAFSA, or actually, you're not, but let me show you what some in-state resources might look like for you. So this is actually a really good case study. So asylum granted versus asylum pending. People who have applied for asylum do so from within the United States. And when they do that, these wait times can be up to, I don't know, many, many years before they get their court date. In that meantime, if they're working with an attorney and they've sort of done all the steps, they're granted a work authorization card, which is great because they get a social security number, they can legally work in the United States, and they can file taxes. So that's great. So while their asylum is pending, they'll have a work authorization card. And as soon as it's granted, they'll get that permanent resident card. And so that's a really good case study for understanding the differences between the cards. So on the left here, you have the permanent resident card, otherwise known as the green card because it's mostly green and blue. And on the right, you have the employment authorization card. Now, if someone has asylum pending, they've received the employment authorization card, they can work, they can file taxes, and they're going to wait for their court date. If it gets approved, then they'll have asylum granted. At that moment, they'll receive, well, it's not immediate, but eventually they'll receive their permanent resident card. Anyone who has a permanent resident card, a green card, can file a FAFSA, can receive federal funds. Anyone who has an employment authorization card, they can still, apply for college and go and thrive and work and be part of work study from like the private fund level, but they can't receive the federal funds. They can't receive the Pell Grant, the Stafford loan, all that. And so as counselors, even if we know this much, even if we don't remember the term exactly, we can ask the student once they've self-disclosed, hey, do you have a card? Do you have some sort of documentation that says what your status is? Can you bring that in? I'd love to review it with you so that I know exactly what you qualify for. And then once you see it, this might ring a bell and say, oh, right, okay, so this is an employment authorization card. This is awesome. This means you can file taxes and work, but unfortunately you can't file a FAFSA with this. Let's go through what you can do. Versus a student brings in a permanent resident card, that's a different conversation. So these are all the things that I think as counselors, we would do well to at least know. And, if in the moment we're unsure, always err on the side of, I don't know, but I'll figure it out. And in the meantime, contact someone that you know can help you. Reach out to me, reach out to Geraldine or Diana, and get guidance for the next time that you meet with your student. So both of these cards give USCIS numbers, so you can see that. They were otherwise a little while ago known as A numbers, alien registration number. We try not to use the word alien in this field. It just sounds awful. It's degrading. I never think of myself as an alien, so we don't say that. But sometimes on the old FAFSA or on some paperwork, you might still see the A number. What they're actually referring to is the USCIS number. And so a lot of my high schoolers, before they've self-disclosed or as they're self-disclosing, might think they can file a FAFSA because their employment authorization card has a USCIS number. And it's not until they bring it in, we have that conversation, that I have to kind of make it clear to them. But every time I do that, I always make sure that they walk away with more next steps. So it's sort of always an asset-based conversation. So just an interesting note there with the USCIS number. To make things more complicated, some statuses like refugee status or certain types of immigration parole don't give out authorization, permanent green card, or employment authorization cards. They might give out I-94s. Some of our older students might still have the paper version of an I-94, which is an arrival departure record that gets stamped, and you can see on the left-hand side, that's an example of what a paper I-94 looks like. It says admitted. There's a stamp there with the date that they've arrived, either at the port of arrival or port of departure. But nowadays, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, is giving out or giving people access to online I-94s. You can see how this can get really complicated really quickly, especially for a high schooler. And so this is what's really important for us to realize is that for me right now, as someone in my 30s, I can take you back and tell you exactly what my statuses were, what we did, but As a 14, 15-year-old, I may not have been able to do the same. And so sometimes even when a student tells you what status they think they have, it's always worth fact finding a little bit more, kind of empowering them to come to the understanding of what their status is, what it might mean for them now, in the future. And also knowing that a lot of them might come from mixed status families, right? So they might be, sometimes we even have students that are undocumented, but they might have a parent that's currently in the process of seeking asylum. We might sometimes have, I mean, they're not the topic of this webinar today, but we sometimes have citizen students that have undocumented parents. That's a whole other conversation. And so it can get quite tricky. Just keep calm, ask questions. The more fact finding you do, you can always kind of piece it together later. And so just really encourage all of you in this moment to think about what you already know about your school community. Are there certain countries that are really represented in your communities? Are there statuses that are more prevalent? Do you have a list of local undocu-friendly colleges around you? Geraldine is going to talk a little bit more about what makes a college undocu-friendly, what you can look out for. So if you're someone that's a little bit more seasoned in this topic, go back and really dig in. If you're completely new, you can start by just taking stock of, okay, what do I know? What do I need to find out? And then take it from there using the resources you learned about tonight. So here, some links, you'll get access to all these links after the presentation, but I always encourage counselors to, just bookmark some of these websites, stay informed about what's happening at your state level, at your national level. For example, in Massachusetts, we just passed our Tuition Equity Act. That's huge for us. And I might not necessarily know exactly what's happening in other states. So there's always, I think, really wonderful national resources that can kind of distill information for all of you. And then also get a sense of student-led things around you. So for example, United We Dream is one of the longest running immigrant-run advocacy organizations. If a student has self-disclosed to me, I know they're undocumented, I'm going to help them with their process, but I'm also going to give them resources for them to do their own, or for them to be on a path of self-discovery and awareness. So I might say, hey, check out United We Dream, check out Immigrants Rising, check out In Schools. They have just some really great resources, not only for counselors, but for students as well. And so I keep talking about self-disclosing. We want to make sure that students self-disclose as early as possible because we want them to maximize resources, right? If we know exactly what their status is, we'll be able to help them. And so just remember that self-disclosing does not have to be scary, but it needs to happen. So we want to encourage self-disclosure, but it's really important for me to drive the point home that us as educators, especially in high schools, can never ask a student or family what their immigration status is. That is completely a no-no. It's very, very bad. Don't do it. And because that's protected by Plyler versus Doe, which is a Supreme Court decision back in 1982 that protects the right of a free education for any student, regardless of status, K through 12. So we can't ask anyone ever what their status is. But if they're the ones to tell you first, right, then it's green light. Then you can feel completely free to ask follow-up questions, to be with them and really help them own their journey. If you suspect there might be an immigration concern, I always go to open-ended questions, especially if we're having, say, a kickoff meeting to their college process. Hey, is there anything else you might want to share with me that might allow me to help you in your process? It might be helpful, if there's anything else going on in your family or whatever, like the more I know, the more I can help. That's my go-to. About half the time they might tell me, about half the time they don't because they don't really trust me or know me yet. But I can get to some tips for that. And I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to keep talking really fast. Please avoid writing emails with sensitive information. Never, ever do that. If you are an adult that a student has self-disclosed to and you want to talk to other adults in your school about it, always ask the student permission first. Hey, thanks so much for sharing this with me. Is it okay if I also loop in Mr. or Miss so-and-so? They might also be able to give you resources. Is that okay? Once a student gives you the yes, you can talk to other people about it, just never put it in writing. And don't ever keep a list anywhere of student statuses, especially not a list that has first name, last name, and status. Just please don't do it. If your school is ever audited, or if there's ever a sort of warrant that gets, passed through to the school, all of that is sort of in that school public domain, and we just don't want to risk any of that sensitive information getting out there. And so the student doesn't really know you. The strongest tool that we have at our disposal is to really set the scene. Take stock of your office, your common spaces. Are they currently undocu-friendly? How can you do this virtually too? So think about your website, your Instagram, your communications. Maybe you have stickers that you give out during parent nights with the butterfly, which is a symbol of immigration. Or maybe there's just a poster that says, we are an undocu-friendly office. Students are always listening. They're always looking, watching. And so even if they don't trust you yet, if they pick up on cues that you're a safe person to talk to, I promise you that they're going to feel safe and will self-disclose eventually. And so I'm going to just briefly wrap up by saying it's really important to respect your students' ability to self-disclose to you. So if you don't know student status, you can always make it so that you give students chances to tell you. You might maybe know already, but maybe they haven't told you. And so if you already know their status, always think about how you found out. If they shared it with you, did they give you permission to share it with others? If you forgot to ask when they first disclosed, don't ever fear coming back to the subject. Say, hey, so remember when you shared with me about your immigration status? Thank you so much for trusting me with that. So I wanted to ask you, would it be okay for me to share what you told me only with so-and-so? If you heard about it from others, then unless that student gave that other person permission to share it, just act as if you didn't know. And none of these tips are rules federally. Once a student self-discloses, it's fine, it's fair game, but this is to preserve the student's dignity and the student's privacy. And if they feel that you are doing that, they will trust you more and more. And so finally, I want to just kind of remind you that really the guiding light for us is the more we know, the more we can tell them, hey, you do qualify for things. And so the federal government has a great resource. It's called the Federal Aid Student Handbook, or sorry, the Financial Aid Administrator Handbook. Volume 1, Chapter 2 does a really beautiful, very technical job of showing you every single status that qualifies for federal aid. So if you are thinking, wow, Andrea's talking way too fast, I can't internalize any of this, these are all the statuses that do qualify for federal aid, always refer to that chapter. And then finally, before I kick it over to Geraldine, I want to just talk briefly about myth busting. Really what this means is bring the students with you, right? Not acting like you know everything, being truthful. I don't know much. I'm really new to this topic, but I'm here with you. Let's go on this journey together and bring students into your thought process. As you're creating college lists for them, you might open up tools like this one, the Higher Ed Immigration Portal, which gives you access to different states' policies around undocumented individuals. So you can click on your state and you can see all data, for example, and you can see what level of access different states have for undocumented students at the public or private level. Geraldine's also going to reference this really great resource called the Higher Ed Immigration Portal, which highlights how 24 states can provide in-state tuition to students, especially as you're list making for students. Don't keep the secret from them. Show it to them. Have them read it also on their own. Maybe they can brainstorm and bring back some suggestions for their college list. It's just really important to treat undocumented students like the vibrant, agency-filled individuals that they are. So Geraldine, I'm going to kick it over to you. Here are some scholarship resources that I always use with my students. You'll get all these links at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Andrea. That is so helpful. And hopefully these are all things that I think you're right, that it can feel like it's a lot to take in. And hopefully these are things that we can all sit with and really take a deep dive into with a little more time. I think, like you said at the beginning, we wish we had a million years to talk about all of this, but we don't. So we're doing our best. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get us started. Here we go. Let me know if you see that.
We
Yeah.
see your desktop right now, like we see it, but you just might have to expand it.
You see it now?
There we are. Yep.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Geraldine Castaneda. I am feeling equally excited, eager, grateful to be here and talk about a topic that is also near and dear to my heart. I'm currently an assistant dean of admissions at Pomona College. I use she, her pronouns. I recruit for a good chunk of the Midwest and some parts of Northern California, specifically the city of Sacramento, which is where I grew up. I was born in Mexico City, came to the States here when I was 4, and currently have DACA. I grew up undocumented for a large majority of my life, and then qualified for DACA, which essentially means that I have one of the cards that Andrea referenced, which is an employment authorization card. It just means that I am here able to work in the capacity that I am and sort of have deferred deportation for the time. So it's a level of protection, and it is still, as Andrea mentioned, a unique, I think, lived experience in that it is such an invisible identity, right? This is a barrier and a limitation that a lot of our students face. And I can say for many of my friends, peers, and for myself, even, this was something I didn't even disclose in high school, right? So it takes, I think, a while of a level of comfortability with others and with yourself, with that identity, to really become open with it. And I think Andrea did a really good job of emphasizing how we might foster that relationship via counselor and student. I'm going to focus more on sort of the aftermath of that. Once that relationship has been established, what it might look like for you to bring in a student and to find these colleges that are undocu-friendly, what it means to find institutions and to create college lists that would be a good fit, not only academically, financially, emotionally for students, but also ones that will support them holistically, right? Whether that mean bringing in their family, legal support, residential experience, location, etc. So I'll start by doing just a quick agenda. We're going to talk about what it means to find an undocu-friendly campus. We talk about that a lot, and I realize that some of these terms might be helpful to break down. So I'll explain a bit about sort of the basics about finding a campus or an institution that is undocu-friendly, what that might look like on paper and websites, on staff, personnel, et cetera. And then I'll talk about how we might tease out some language. I think there's nuance to the way that some institutions and schools are talking about undocumented students that I think is worth teasing out. So we'll talk about how to find those, sort of read between the lines on the websites for some of our institutions. I'll talk about what it might look like to find resource centers, legal support at different college campuses, how they might vary state to state, and how to gauge the level of support that a student might need. Then I'll also go into, again, a pretty surface level understanding of the financial aid differences for undocumented students, and how that might vary state to state, how it might vary private to public institution, and what it might mean to find the best financial package for your particular student. And then I'll also talk about non-Social Security work opportunities. As we know, this is a population, many of whom will not have Social Security or a work permit. So I'll talk about what it looks like to find an institution that has support for students to make money and to make a living as they are, still human beings on a campus. And then lastly, I'll talk about considerations for location and the residential experience of college. So we'll dive in with the sort of undocu-friendly campus experience. this is, again, a term that I think we use very loosely and very broadly, but I think I've noted a few specific search tools or things that you might look out for in finding institutions, campuses, organizations that are undocu-friendly. For colleges specifically, I think it can be important to find institutions that firstly will read undocumented students as domestic applicants, right? So there's a lot of financial aid packaging that happens after a student is admitted. There's a lot of support that can happen once a student is admitted. But first, it can be a very green light to find institutions who say, yes, we know that your citizenship might not be based out of the US, but we will still read you as a domestic applicant. Many schools do this, many states even allow for this. You can find institutions whose language centers around, if a student graduated from a high school within the US, we will still read them as a domestic applicant, which then allows those students to get all of the domestic in-state tuition, other financial aid opportunities, other campus support that other domestic students might get as well, even if they don't have US citizens. So that's a good place to start. I've listed a few here, obviously going to name drop Pomona, but many other institutions are on this list. Secondly, moving out of the sort of individual institution, it can be helpful to find states at large that will offer in-state tuition to undocumented students. So this means that, many institutions will have a domestic financial aid budget and then an international financial aid budget for students who are coming in from high schools abroad. Most of the time, many institutions will read undocumented students as international students, right? Saying, again, you do not have US citizenship, so we're going to read you as an international student, which has a limited budget. And so if you can find schools, if you can find states that allow undocumented students to be read as domestic applicants, that can also be a good sort of a larger bucket of a state or of a location to look for schools. Thirdly, here, it can be very helpful to find institutions who provide need-based financial aid for undocumented students. This means that institutions are providing money based on your financial need as opposed to your merit, things like talent, things like test scores, et cetera. Institutions that provide need-based financial aid for undocumented students also are largely in a place to equip students more holistically financially. And then the fourth point here is another sort of broad green light to look for, sort of a signal of campuses that they are undocu-friendly is when they have been named sanctuary campuses. This comes from larger statewide designations and citywide policies, wherein certain states, certain cities can say we are a sanctuary city, whereby they are saying we will not sort of work with federal immigration enforcement, right? So cities have named themselves sanctuary cities. Counties can do that. It is also the case that colleges can say we are a sanctuary campus, meaning if we are asked by the federal government to provide a list or names of students who are undocumented, they will not sort of hand those names over, which is also, back to Andrea's point, an important note to sort of scrap lists on the whole, right? Those lists should not exist should these federal enforcement obligations come through, but it can be a good signal from campuses to say they are sanctuary campuses as a note to sort of a protective measure for undocumented students. And then the last note here that I have with a caveat is campuses that refer to undocumented students as dreamers. Some schools will have sort of a dreamer resource center, things like that. As we know, and Andrea mentioned, this movement of DACA particularly, but immigrant rights and immigrants in higher ed at large goes back decades and decades. And it is the case that once DACA sort of came out into the public sphere, language of dreamer students, right, students who were, pursuing the dream, the American dream of their parents and families became really prominent. And that is still, I think, a large language consideration. So I'll note that it can be a really good signal for friendly campuses, friendly organizations. And I'll just make the note that it may be a little outdated for some of these movements, right? Where we have students who are pushing against the dreamer narrative, saying we are more than just our education, we are more than just the American dream, et cetera. So those are some basic pointers to find. This is to tease out some of the language on our actual websites, right? So we have sanctuary schools here who, again, will have made a commitment to their students that they will not enforce federal asks or obligations if asked by the federal government. So essentially, they will not pass out names of students or information, private information on students and their families. Something that I mentioned too is this idea that we're using language of undocumented students as opposed to aliens or illegal students on our campus. That can be, I think, if we're thinking of green flags, red flags, pretty prominent red flag can be organizations, institutions, campuses, websites using language of illegal or alien. A large green flag that you'll find from websites or from campuses is to refer to policies that say regardless of citizenship status, right? And that is at large. That covers the broad range of statuses and students that I mentioned in that really comprehensive list, right? Regardless of citizenship status, we will provide these funds for you. We will provide the support for you. So that can be a pretty large umbrella term for institutions to use that can be helpful to point students toward. And then lastly, I think one of the really important things that this is something maybe less logistical and certainly more applicable to students, or maybe a task you might impart on a student, is to say, look on a website, see if they have an undocumented student coordinator, see if they have an undocumented student resource, see if they have a contact person for undocumented students. Many institutions now will have a point person on their website or someone who, an email of sorts, and that can also be a way for campuses to signal, we are aware, we have someone in our office who has the lingo, who has the understanding to support you through this process. And that can be a really good way to get students immersed in the process, to start with something that maybe feels a little more accessible, right, as opposed to some of this larger legal information. And then, as always, we'll add a bit of nuance, right, to these conversations. I think as we're looking for institutions and campuses that have really explicit language on supporting undocumented students and on being allies for undocumented students or all students regardless of citizenship status. I think it is also worth noting that some institutions, either due to size, due to climate in their cities and their states, or other reasons, will be a little more broad, right? Will have more vague language on their websites. And that is sort of the big dilemma that we find in these spaces, is that many institutions, many well-meaning folks, groups, organizations are a little more broad, are a little more vague in hopes of protecting students, right? So they will not have the same student profile of an undocumented student on their website in the same way that they might have for different identity groups, right? And so this is where it can be a little difficult to sort of tease out how supportive is this school, how open, explicit are they about supporting undocumented students if it's not on their front page, if there isn't a student profile, if there isn't something explicit. Many institutions do this, again, as a way of protecting our students. I think a lot and talk a lot about sort of the irony of the undocumented label, right? And the fear of documenting the undocumented, right? And that's, I think, something that personally we all feel, and at a larger organizational scale is a fear to sort of reckon with, right? That you want resource centers, you want profiles out publicly, and also you can't name drop in specific students. You can't name drop a specific movement. You can't name drop specific professors. And so I just want to add a bit of nuance there and mention that some of these sort of, we'll have to do a bit of decoding and reading through the lines for some of these resources. And then I'll add the sort of other extreme here, is that many institutions with no language at all on undocumented students, no language at all on providing, students regardless of citizenship status, if there is nothing to be found, I think that is also a signal, right? That can also be telling you something based on, again, the school, the state, the city that the school is located in. So nothing at all is also a point of information, of data, if you will. Once you've found maybe an institution or a set of institutions that are initially feeling undocu-friendly, these are some of more sort of nitty-gritty resources that you can think to ask for. You can prompt students to call and research on, and you can also certainly find on websites. Obviously, the largest here being an undocumented student coordinator or resource center. Is there one person? Are there many people at an office equipped and ready on deck to support undocumented students? A third one that many institutions have started to advertise a little more openly is legal support. So this means campuses, offices will offer help with sort of an attorney or a lawyer to help process a new form, or access to a lawyer in case some issue arises. It is worth noting here that some institutions extend this service to families. That can be a great conversation point to have with students. Is this something you foresee needing for family members at all? Is a family member in the process of a specific form or immigration process that they might require support for? It can also be helpful to find institutions that provide pretty open or explicit undocumented student club, or an organization of sorts where you will know that there are other undocumented students here, right? There has to be a cohort of us if there is a club on campus. Or sometimes those clubs, organizations will be hosting events that center the undocumented immigrant experience. This can look like a run, it can look like a campaign, it can look like different events on campus that will allow students to see themselves celebrated, joyful in these spaces. Another thing worth noting or sort of looking for is faculty who either support undocumented students, who do research on these processes, who are interested in undocumented policy, whether that be at the state level or at the national level. That can be a good sort of pointer to say, hey, there will be a mentor here on campus for me. There's someone who I can look to academically. And then last but certainly not least is this idea of accessible mental health appointments, right? Is there a way for me, when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, to an emergency, for me to get support with a mental health practitioner, with resources, some online therapy, et cetera? This is worth asking regardless of citizenship status, but I think it can be helpful specifically for this population. On the right here, I just have some questions that might be useful to guide students in this reflection. How much is a student valuing their ability to share this lived experience on campus? It might be the case that they're looking at a small school with a small undocumented student population, and they might be okay with that, as opposed to maybe they want a larger institution where there's hundreds, maybe tens of students there with the shared undocumented experience. I think it is, again, the nuance here is to sort of pause and ask the student, right? If the student is undocumented, if they've self-disclosed, we cannot assume that is their biggest identity on campus, right? That is the biggest way that they are showing up. It can be helpful to understand where sort of on their priority list this identity falls. Is this something that they really need to feel seen and heard and supported with, or are there other priorities, whether that be their racial identity, their sexual orientation, right? Other needs, resources that they feel are more important to look for in an institution. This one might fall lower, or is this the one, right? And that can help to sort of create this list for them. And for colleges specifically, you can ask about how they prioritize supporting undocumented students on their campus, and what resources exist for students in case of emergencies. I'm going to go into some of the financial aid, sort of the nitty-gritty here, which feels maybe a little detailed and is also very, very surface level. But I'll talk about the different financial aid sort of offers that can come, and how private and public institutions might have either or a combination of them, and how any combination of these might be best for your students. So need-based aid is essentially referring to institutions that provide financial aid based on need, right? So this is a student who has filled out all the financial aid profile, the California DREAM Act, whether that be the FAFSA, whether that be the CSS profile. They've filled out their information, their tax returns to the best of their abilities. And need-based aid is a way that schools package students by saying, based on what these documents are telling us, this is how much financial aid you need, and this is how much we can give you. That is different from merit aid, which is completely based on a student's talent. So not necessarily on their need. This can be a high-income student who has great grades, who is coming in for a sport, musical talent, for rank in class, national merit scholar, etc. Regardless of financial sort of income, we will give you financial aid based on talent. Yeah. So it's need-based, merit aid. Many institutions have a combination of both. It is the case that some institutions only do need-based. It is the case that some only do merit. Many will offer both to our students. But what I want to note here is that private institutions are in a place, for the most part, where they are relying on private aid, right? They obviously have much federal aid and state aid that they can use at their disposal, but many private institutions will be going on need-based aid and will be providing students financial aid based on their private funds, which sometimes can mean that they have a little more discretion as to who those funds are going to. And that is different from notably public institutions. Public institutions rely heavily on federal aid, on state aid, which can be limited for undocumented students based on the state, right? Depending on how undocu-friendly a state might be, their state or federal aid might be limited for undocumented students. So this is also, I think, something to consider as you think of sort of the college creation list. I think generally it can be helpful to start students, right? Let them ideate, allow them to do their research and have their ideal list of colleges. And then as they self-disclose, as you get comfortable with them, as this priority comes and falls into place for them, that is when we can start considering the financial aid processes, how we're being financially supported, right? What scholarships might come in, what resources are available to students. So this is just a sort of higher level understanding of the different financial aid types, just noting that many of these financial aid types, specifically if they're coming in through federal or state aid, will vary state to state and might be highly or sort of on a spectrum limited for undocumented students. All right, so we're kind of going through the process, right, of college search, of self-disclosure, of college list making, financial aid once a student is here, once they've sort of made their decision to come to a campus. Say they're here on a specific campus, right? Now you're thinking of how is a student thriving once they're here, right? When they are living and breathing at this institution. It is important to note that many students who are undocumented, depending on their specific sort of status and designation, many will not have a social security number. This means many are not allowed to work, right? So they are not legally allowed to be employed by a college, by an institution, by an organization, an internship, et cetera. And so the question stands, how are these students supporting themselves? They are still students. They are still wanting to go get dinner with their friends. They're still needing, right, clothes. They're still needing dorm essentials, books, et cetera. This is something I think goes sort of, we think so much of the financial aid process of getting a student to a campus, and then what falls by the wayside is this idea of supporting students once they're here. So this can be a really helpful place to start ideating as well the college list and getting a sense of how a student will be supported once they are away from family and fully in their college process. For students who are not able to secure a job on campus, there are institutions who will provide grants to replace their work-study allotment, right? So many institutions will say, this is your financial aid package. Part of your financial aid package requires that you work on campus and earn $4,000 of those dollars on your own. Yeah. Because these students are undocumented and cannot work, they are leaving $4,000 on the table, or they are having to make up those $4,000 somehow. And that can be a large financial gap for many of our undocumented students. So it is worth asking a financial aid office or a practitioner within the admissions office to ask, do you offer grants to replace work-study allotments for our students? If a financial aid office is not able to do that, some schools will offer an alternative sort of fellowship that can say, we can't actually sort of contract you by hour, can't pay you by wage, but we can allow you to participate, to apply for a fellowship that will give you a grant, right? So at Pomona, we have a fellowship that says you can, for undocumented students to apply, you get $800 a semester, and you have to complete an educational sort of project to receive those $800. Obviously, it is not the equivalent of a work study, but it is still a way for students to receive some kind of income or some kind of financial compensation during their time in school. What we also know is that many internships or research opportunities that allow all of our college students to flourish, to have pre-professional development, career development on campus, are limited for undocumented students as well. And that is sometimes through the institution, that is sometimes just due to the internship organization, right? Or research organization. So it is worth asking the career development office, it is worth asking the admissions office if they are aware of private internship opportunities that schools can provide students that are open to undocumented undocumented students. Also worth asking if research opportunities, whether that be by private professors' grants or private professors' funds or department funds, are able to grant students financial compensation to do research with them while on campus. The last thing we want is for a student, undocumented student, to get into an incredible institution, to get the financial aid that they need, and then be on campus and not be sort of advancing in the same way as their peers. So it's worth asking the professional financial aid questions and then also career development. Lastly, I think this is something that, again, is maybe not of highest priority, but certainly allows students to feel seen and to feel part of a community when they are in the college campus. What we know is a sort of pivotal experience for many students in college is the idea of study abroad, right? This opportunity to explore beyond your college campus, to go beyond, borders. And while we understand that many undocumented students are coming from different countries themselves, it can be worth asking if institutions offer a sort of alternative to study abroad. Many undocumented students will not be able to leave the United States, right, and be able to return. And so some institutions will offer domestic exchange programs to say, I can't have you leave the country, but I can have you go to San Jose. I can have you go to Washington, D.C. I can have you do a domestic exchange at a different institution. All right, and then last, I'll just end here. We'll finish with location and the residential experience, right? This is something worth noting as we think of sort of the different policy levels, right? As a student is considering going to a school maybe away from home, maybe in a different city, maybe across the country, it can be worth researching, doing a bit of questioning for the federal policies at large, right? So something coming in now, the Real ID Act, saying for anyone without a social security number, you are not able to get a Real ID, which means you cannot board domestic flights, right? If a student is looking at a school that will be across the country, that will require them to fly across the country, and if they are not able to find, or if they are not able to acquire a social security number and then apply for a Real ID Act, they might not be able to go home for break, right? They might not be able to even travel there for their first year in the coming years. So federal policies are something to keep sort of in your peripheral, and Andrea shared great slides for those to keep sort of bookmarked and top of mind. Also worth noting, state policies are different across the country, right? Which institutions are more undocu-friendly, which ones will allow students to consider in-state tuition, which ones might not. I can tell you right now, there are 3 in the South that say undocumented students are not eligible for public institutions here at all. So it is worth going through that resource, tapping on each individual state and seeing what is allowed and what is not. And then lastly, you might consider institutional policies, right? What it means for a student to go across the country and then perhaps need housing on campus, right? If housing is not guaranteed and a student is needing to rent an apartment, what might it look like for a student without a social security number, without proof of work, right? To not be able to apply for an apartment and therefore not have housing secured on campus, right? These are smaller considerations that I think once a student arrives here is worth digging into. So for time's sake, I will end there and pass it back to Diana to close us out. Thank you all for sticking with us here. I know we shared a lot.
Yes, amazing. Thank you both so much. I think I speak for everyone on the call tonight that was a lot of information, and I feel like gives everybody a lot of food for thought, kind of going back to your schools, your communities, the students you serve, and really we just really want to hone in on the fact that this is just the beginning of many conversations I hope that you have with us, with our 2 presenters who are very open to hearing from you as well, and hoping that this is also the beginning of a conversation of a body of work at CEG as well. So really just hoping that that information feels empowering to you all, even if it's a little bit overwhelming in the moment. I know that there have been some questions in the chat. I think Andrea has been really great at getting to a few of them, talking about kind of work opportunities for undocumented students while they're in college, which Geraldine, you talked about in your slides, and Andrea supplemented with some resources that will go out to you in that post-event email. The TAFSA is open to undocumented students, which is exciting, and there's some resources there. Yes, for sure. Head is spinning, but this is great. Yeah, that feels very, very accurate for the topic at hand. We have like about a minute or 2 for any like quick last minute questions. But I think, Geraldine, this is actually probably something you might be able to answer. Allison asked, if a school requires the undocumented student to complete the certificate of finances, like other international students, would that be not friendly? Some colleges waive that for undocumented students. That seems like the more appropriate response. I don't know if Geraldine or Andrea, you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can say a wave of those forms is probably going to be the most appropriate for students. And it might just be the case that the financial aid office needs that prompt, right? It might not be coming from any kind of ill intent, but sometimes the coding for students as they come into the process will mark them as international. And so there might have to be some more explicit communication between the financial aid office, admissions office to say, hey, actually, I went to high school here for 4 years. I don't have this international paperwork. Can I get it waived? So yes, I think that I wouldn't say that's like a way to mark off an entire institution, but the clarification might be helpful first.
Yes, definitely. Amazing. We are at time, so I want to be mindful of that. Again, all of the resources that were shared tonight will be sent to you all in a follow-up email. We're really hopeful that this is the first of many conversations, both at CEG and in your communities back home. Thank you all so much for being here. Geraldine and Andrea, thank you both so much for just being thought partners in this and for being here tonight. You both are amazing. Yes, they are presenting at conferences, so keep your eyes out for both of these superstars, truly like some amazing voices in this space. So thank you both so much, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you. Really enjoyable.
Yes,
everyone.
Please.
Thank you.